Welcome, everyone. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, and we are very proud to sponsor one of our weekly webinar series on the unrestricted warfare the Chinese Communist Party and its friends have been waging against our country relentlessly for decades, unbeknownst to the vast majority of Americans, unfortunately, and it seems even now, still too few of our leaders are clued up about it. We consider this a public service as well as a privilege to speak to you all, and those who will not be with us in person at the moment, but will view this video in the days to come, because it's one of the most important we'll be doing, informed by what has happened very recently in Beijing and another city in communist China, in which the Chinese Communist Party put on the dog, in a manner of speaking, for a meeting of various heads of state under the banner of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also to witness, in most cases, I think, not all, but most, the parade of an immense array of advanced and very dangerous weapon systems that the Chinese Communist Party has been building, as those of you who have been following these programs know, with help from us, with help in terms of stolen technology, with help from us in terms of the infusion of funds from American pension funds, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, index funds, college tuition funds, and other investment vehicles here in the United States, some of which have gone directly into companies supporting the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and thereby making possible the largest military buildup in the history of the world. And recall, folks, that the weapons that were paraded in Tiananmen Square are by and large aimed at us, either our forces in forward deployed positions in the region of China or here at home as well. We're going to focus on two specific upshots of these events. One is the issue of a newly announced, very explicit priority by Chinese dictator Xi Jinping, announced, as I recall, in the course of his welcoming statement to the SCO, as it's known, namely a commitment to a, quote, global governance initiative, unquote. Not a secret exactly. They've been talking this up for some time, but it's apparently now going to be given a very urgent priority by the Chinese communists, and you can believe it, their friends, both elsewhere around the world, notably in various United Nations offices, and of course, amongst elites that support them and are seeking to advance communist China's interests, not a few of whom are here in the United States of America, alas. We'll be talking a bit about that priority, that agenda, what it means for not just China, of course, but for the world, including, of course, the United States, if we are to be governed by some entity other than our constitutional republic and the arrangements specified in that constitution, but instead by wholly unaccountable, unelected, and probably Chinese communists, rulers in the stead of those we elect to represent us. Secondly, we're going to talk about the prospect with that military buildup and the increasing flexing of the muscles of the People's Liberation Army and its friends, again, notably Russia, North Korea, and Iran, to add to the unrestricted, if you will, pre-kinetic kind of war that we've been subjected to for so long, the old-fashioned kind, a shooting war. Could that be in our future? And if so, where and what might it entail? We'll get into all of that with an extraordinary group of our best and brightest, many of the members of our Committee on the Present Danger China, others great friends and valued allies. We're going to start with, as we often do in these programs, a segment of an interview that I conducted with one of our foremost naval intelligence officers, now retired from the Navy, Captain James Fennell. He is these days associated with the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He is a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China. He is the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer of a very important book entitled Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Let's go to the video with Captain Fennell now.
But the most important thing that happened in this SCO plus meeting was revealed this morning in their press, which said that President Xi Jinping revealed to the SCO and to the world the new global governance initiative. It's a first to be revealed at the SCO, and it combines with the three other global initiatives that China has put forward, Xi has put forward, which is the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. And these now, joined with this Global Governance Initiative, are what they say are needed right now because global governance is falling apart. The global South is not being represented. There's an erosion of authoritativeness, and there's an urgent need for greater effectiveness. And they put forward 5 principles of this global governance initiative. One is to adhere to sovereign equality, to abide by international rule of law, practice multilateralism, advance people-centered approach, and focus on taking real actions. And that's what they want to do. And that's the system that they're building. And it sounds very attractive to many people. They're not acquainted with the war and what occurred and the system that was put in place that helped a lot of these small nations have a better economy, more equity in the world at the United Nations, that was all set up as a result of the end of World War II. You know, the Chinese call what happened on the 2nd of September, and now what they're calling on the 3rd of September, they call it the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War. And World Anti-Fascist War is not just a war against Japan. The term anti-fascist war is a communist term. The Soviet Union used it, and it was about going after capitalism in America and the West. So what China is saying is, we're still at war, we're still in a struggle, communists against capitalists, which are fascist by their definition, and we are going to defeat you. So when they say we want to have a global governance system, it doesn't mean that they want to have it where America gets to represent our way of life and our system of governance. They want to crush that and replace it with their system, which means that they're in control and they get to call the shots. And if you step out of line, you will be crushed.
We are going to follow with another of our interviews, what Captain Fennell has just emphasized in terms of the degree to which we are witnessing a, to use Barack Obama's expression, fundamental transformation of our country, along with the rest of the world, to the extent that this so-called global governance agenda is being advanced, with a man who has spent most of his life, of late at least, focused on what's going on at the United Nations. Alex Newman is a journalist by avocation, but a profoundly knowledgeable individual with respect to the various threats to our country, whether it's from the Chinese communists, whether it's from other totalitarians, notably what I call the Sharia supremacists, or the globalists, kind of totalitarian trifecta, is my way of characterizing it. And we wanted to tap his insights based on the kind of research he's done, often firsthand in the United Nations offices themselves, in the World Health Organization and the like, monitoring both the Chinese penetration and influence operations in those quarters, but also the results of them and what they might mean for us. We have, again, the opportunity to have him with us when he could not be otherwise, through a very, very important hour-long interview that he did with me for our program, Securing America, on Real America's Voice. And we're going to give you an excerpt of it, a highlight reel, if you will, of Alex Newman's comments. Let's go to those now.
I think there's a lot of ways to analyze this problem of global government, but I would start just with the pragmatic approach. When you have a global government, it will be a magnet for the very worst kind of people. And historically, we've seen that. Government power tends to attract people who want to wield it for improper purposes. Thankfully, the fact that we have sovereign nation states has kept those ambitions in check. When one leader went too crazy, Adolf Hitler, pick your crazy dictator, there were other nations to put a stop to those ambitions before they could get too far out of control. What happens when you have a global government and there is no longer any force that can properly withstand that power? Well, you have a recipe for disaster. It would attract every Hitler, every Castro, every Pol Pot, every Stalin. They'd all be stabbing each other in the back and murdering each other's moms to try to rise to the top of that hierarchy. Incredibly dangerous situation. Secondly, we see the very people who are building these institutions, and we know quite a bit about them because they speak publicly, they write essays, they give speeches, and we can see from their actions the kind of things that they believe. And the Chinese Communist Party is a very good example of this. I mean, these are ruthless individuals. They've slaughtered at least 100 million of their own people, if you don't count the babies that they've butchered in forced abortions. I mean, what do you think they will do to you if they end up in charge of a global system with the ability to impose their will on you? So I think for a whole number of reasons, and we could go into the biblical reason, it was God's idea to divide people up into nations. He says it repeatedly in the scriptures. And there's just something really important about the limiting power that nations have. So I think there's a lot of reasons, Frank, but those are some of the key ones. I think the reason this continues is because there's a lot of powerful people who want it to continue, Frank. And I mentioned the Chinese Communist Party. While they're taking over the architecture of global governance, at the same time they are also progressively strengthening it. But at the same time, we have very powerful forces in the United States. Some of the most powerful men on Wall Street. Larry Fink is a good example. He just became the co-chair of the World Economic Forum. This guy's on record publicly to the media saying that markets prefer totalitarian government. I mean, this is crazy stuff. This is absolutely crazy stuff. Totalitarian societies don't innovate. They imitate. They rip off people's technology. But we have very, very powerful people in the United States, in China, in Europe, in London, a lot of the capitals of the world, and also a lot of the powerful financial people who believe that they will benefit by creating this. And I think their most powerful tool, Frank, you alluded to it briefly in the introduction, they're manipulating the minds and the beliefs of the next generation. And they're doing it very strategically, very deliberately. The UN even has an agency, it's called UNESCO, that since the 1940s has been very openly working to groom children to believe that global government is the answer to all of our problems. If we have a global government, we won't have war. If we have a global government, we can stop climate change. If we have a global government, we won't have international tax avoidance and evasion. So they are being conditioned to see global government as the solution to everything. And they're also being conditioned to believe that the system we are leaving behind, at least here in America, the system, as you mentioned, of God-given rights, of a government that exists to protect these rights, that is somehow malevolent, that it was created by bad guys because they are dead and they are white and they were 250 years ago, and so therefore we shouldn't care anymore, or we should reject what they had to say, even though that represented, I think, one of the highest achievements that mankind ever reached. So we have all these forces coalescing around this idea, and people are going to see in the next few years it's going to become increasingly obvious. They're going to be coming out of the closet more and more. Guterres is a really good example. I mean, this is a guy who openly allied himself with socialists his entire political carear. He was a member of the Portuguese Socialist Party. After that, he actually became the head of the Socialist International.
But socialists aren't communists, Alex.
Right. Yeah, they're communists with a slightly different outer wrapper. But if you look at his track record as head of the Socialist International, that's the biggest organization of socialist political parties in the world, there's a lot of former communist parties in there. There's a lot of current communists and Marxists in there, some of whom have the blood of millions of innocent people on their hand. So you listen to Guterres, he's got much more in common with Xi Jinping and the CCP than he does, say, with the ideas that made America great, with the ideas of the American founding fathers. The UN is absolutely filled with leaders from the CCP, and they're not even shy about admitting it anymore. They have a school of global governance in Beijing at the Foreign Service University, and they are openly taking over the architecture of the UN. I started digging into this over a decade ago. I've written many articles about it in the New American, in the Epoch Times, in Diplomat magazine. The last time I looked, and it's been maybe a couple of years since I've looked, but 5 of the 15 UN specialized agencies were being run by members of the CCP, at least another 3 or 4 by well-known puppets of the CCP. And for perspective, there was one American running one of the least important of these agencies, the World Food Program. So that gives you a sense of how deeply infiltrated the UN is.
That's John McCain's widow, the last time I checked. On this question of imputing to these wholly unaccountable bureaucrats, whether it's Guterres at the UN or it's people like Ghebreyesus at the World Health Organization, it seems to be something that is becoming much more invasive, if I can use that expression. You were present, notably, when the Pact for the Future was approved at the United Nations. Tell us about what it gives Guterres the authority to do and how he is responding to that new authorization.
I was there covering this for the New American magazine. It was unbelievable to see this because I've never seen such openness about the direction that the UN was going, and they actually framed it as the UN was becoming UN 2.0, and whereas UN 1.0 was supposed to deal with international peace and security, UN 2.0 was going to handle education, the environment, the economy, climate change, the internet, free speech, artificial intelligence, every area of life. And in this agreement that they adopted by so-called consensus, in other words, every government in the world agreed to at least let it pass and become part of the body of what they kind of pretend like is international law. They specifically say in there, and I warned that this was coming in 2023 in a big article for the Epoch Times because I had the reports from Guterres. They say that the UN needs to be strengthened to deal with international emergencies. And in the original policy brief that Guterres put out in 2023, I believe it was policy brief number 2, he lists all kinds of different international emergencies that might require UN leadership: climate change, environmental problems, wars, economic problems, public health concerns, black swan events that we couldn't predict, something in outer space. It could be even a regional issue. And they say then, right in the text of this document, that the UN and its agencies would become the primary decision-making authority and that all stakeholders would have to defer to their decisions. And so what you have here is quite literally the announcement of a global government-style machine that would take the reins over everything in the event of an emergency, declared, by the way, by Guterres or a future Secretary General, with no checks and balances on that declaration.
And to the extent that this is becoming, again, more enshrined in so-called international law, more enabled by acquiescence at best, at worst, actual connivance, as we saw under the Biden administration, and the ascendancy in a position that is not necessarily in an official sense powerful, but by virtue of the economic resources at the disposal of a guy like Larry Fink, now running the World Economic Forum. To say nothing of, Xi Jinping's new global governance initiative becoming the top priority of his statecraft, it would seem as though those of us who are worried about our sovereignty and the implications of it being crushed in the interest of world government are going to have a full employment program at best. Alex, what do we do about what is now emerging, as you've described it so well in this 2 segments preceding and this one?
Yeah, I'll start by saying it's very hard to overstate the influence of Larry Fink in this whole process. A lot of these globalists have talked about the three-legged stool approach to making these transformational global changes. The first leg of the stool is, of course, governments, and that's where the UN comes in with 193 member states. The second leg of the stool is the business community, and that's where the World Economic Forum came in. They actually signed a strategic partnership with the UN about 7 years ago, where they specifically said they were going to bring the international business community to the table on implementing the UN's 2030 agenda, which they called the Master Plan for Humanity, which the CCP boasted they played a crucial role in developing. And then, of course, the third leg of the stool is religion, which right now they're also working at the same time to bring all the major religions of the world on board with this agenda. And so to your question about what do we do about this, I think we need a multifaceted approach. The first step is to understand what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with people who just have bad policy ideas. We're dealing with people who want power over our lives, and they need to be opposed. And I think step one, it begins in our individual lives. We need to protect our children from this kind of indoctrination that the UN is offering. Trump has done a great thing by getting us out of UNESCO, but UNESCO actually bragged in their response to Trump that they're going to keep working with all their American partners anyway. And so they basically said, we don't care if you leave. We're going to keep brainwashing American children. So I'd urge American parents really take this seriously. My wife and I, we homeschool our 6 children. We use Classical Conversations. I wouldn't trade it for the world, but I encourage everybody, find a suitable alternative, whether it's a good Christian school, Catholic school, homeschool, lots of good options out there. That's step one, protect your children from being indoctrinated. Step two, we need to be involved in the public arena. We need our members of Congress to listen to what we're saying. We need the president to keep fighting this. And we need Congress to enshrine into law a lot of what Donald Trump has done through executive order and executive policy. So critical that we get this done.
Amen to that, Alex. Thank you for your expertise on these matters and your clarity in bringing them to our attention as truly a threat to all we hold dear in this country. We're going to broaden the lens a bit and introduce the second of our two topics, namely the threats of a growing capability on the part of the Chinese Communist Party and its allies to engage in actual physical, violent hostilities against those of us in the free world. If they can't seduce us into accepting their global rule, there is another plan, and that is to impose it upon us. We have with us, for the purpose of giving a perspective from people very much on the front lines of what the Chinese have in mind on the violent option front, namely Taiwan, a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Garmant Leilari, another member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, a man who has spent much of his life after he left the service in the Far East, focused on the Chinese order of battle and preparations to wield it against Taiwan. He's done so formerly as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taiwan fellow and also as a visiting scholar at the National Chengchi University, and its National Defense University. He is these days a visiting researcher at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. Among other things, he's going to introduce, we love acronyms here, of course, the term CRINC, which stands for this aggregation of serious bad actors: Communist China, of course, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. We had a chance to visit with him also at Securing America. I hope you will please take advantage of the resources that are available on all of those programs. We do them every day at Real America's Voice. You can follow them most easily at securingamerica.substack.com. Let's go to the video with Germán now.
The topic I'm going to cover is focused on a Taiwanese perspective of what's going on with Xi and his gang of other conspirators against the United States. What I want to focus in on is Xi Jinping's speech at the parade, the contents of it, and a few other aspects that are related to that. So the first thing I'd like to mention is irony. The irony of Xi Jinping speaking about that he wants peace and that it's a wonderful thing, it's an important thing. All the while, he's showing off his military hardware with precision and almost Nazi-like display with his goose-stepping soldiers, reminiscent of the Nazi marching routine. Here was one of the quotes that he says: "Only when all countries and nations treat each other as equals, coexist in peace and support each other, can uphold common security, eradicate the root cause of war, and prevent the recurrence of historical tragedies." That, to him, is important to say in a military parade. It's ironic because the only country in Asia that's not following his guidance is China. He is not treating other countries as equals. China has been acting like a bully for quite a while, at least 3 decades. They do not treat other countries as equals. They treat them as vassal states, much like the previous Chinese emperors have done for 500 years, causing these countries to be humiliated by China. He talks about coexist in peace. So let's take a look at some of the things that China has been doing the last few years. Conducting sabotage against fiber optic cables, ramming Filipino ships, using lasers against US and allied aircraft, threatening to annex Taiwan. This is not peaceful. It is warlike. And the CCP will not stop with Taiwan. I suspect that their hateful rhetoric against Japan will also lead to violence against Japan. This is not peaceful behavior. In fact, it is dangerous and could spark war, the opposite of peace. That's why it's ironic. He talks about support each other. The CCP wants all countries to comply with whatever they want, destroying traditional fishing areas of local fishermen, building up illegal islands into military fortresses. This is not supporting each other. And he talks about preventing historical tragedies. The CCP's actions are, in fact, going to lead to tragedies, massive tragedies. He also said during his speech in 2010, a similar kind of quote: "The Chinese people love peace." It's just ironic that he's talking about peace in a military parade. The second highlight I'd like to make is that he says the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression and the world anti-fascist war. So notice, for example, he doesn't refer to imperial Japanese aggression. He talks about Japanese aggression. And this is important because he is continuing to point to Japan as being aggressive even after 80 years the war is over and Japan has been peaceful and has moved on, just like Nazi Germany has moved on to Germany and is not Nazi. She doesn't want to acknowledge that the Chinese war against imperial Japan was mostly fought by the Chinese nationalist forces under the KMT, not by the communists. In fact, there are 2 important historical notes that I'd like to point out about this important note. When the Imperial Japanese delegation surrendered on the USS Missouri, there were 2 Chinese officers on board, and one of them signed the instruments of surrender of Japan on 2nd September 1945. One was General Xu Yongchang, who was Chiang Kai-shek's senior military advisor during World War II in China, who spoke no English. The second person on the bridge of the USS Missouri, or the flat area of the USS Missouri where it was signed, was Colonel Zhang Ji. He was China's military representative to the US military. Specifically, he worked for General MacArthur's staff during World War II. Additionally, he was the 7th Chinese officer to graduate from the US Military Academy at West Point in 1932. So after the signing ceremony started off with the Japanese delegation, they signed first. There were several of them that signed. Then the next group of people were the allies, starting off with General MacArthur, General Nimitz, and then the Chinese general, General Yongchang. He signed for China. And the reason why he signed as the third was in recognition of the amount of people that died in China and the military forces that fought against Imperial Japan. They lost a lot of people. So this was a recognition of the central role that the Chinese nationalist forces played in World War II. I want to make a third point, is that Xi Jinping claims that China won the war against Japan. He says 80 years ago, the Chinese people thoroughly defeated the Japanese militarist aggressors after fighting a bitter and heroic war of resistance for 14 years. Yeah, the Chinese people fought for 14 years. The Chinese Communist Party was really a small part of it. And just to be clear, the communist forces mainly conducted guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, not force on force. The last thing I'd like to mention is the threats to Taiwan in Xi Jinping's speech. He did not mention Taiwan directly, but what he did mention several times was the code word rejuvenation. He said it at least 4 times. According to Xi Jinping, the PRC cannot achieve rejuvenation of China without the annexation of Taiwan. So he says the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is unstoppable, meaning the annexation of Taiwan is unstoppable. He's calling on the People's Liberation Army to provide strategic support for national rejuvenation. Code word, the PLA will be involved in attacking Taiwan. And he exhorted the Chinese people to advance national rejuvenation on all fronts through Chinese modernization. In other references to Taiwan that were quoted, he wanted to emphasize sovereignty. Xi vowed to safeguard, quote, national sovereignty and territorial integrity, unquote, and is considered to be a reference to annexation of Taiwan. And he mentioned the role of the military is, in the People's Liberation Army, is to defend the country's sovereignty and unity, again, reinforcing the idea that he intends to use the military to take Taiwan. My final point is, let's talk about the Soviet Union during World War II and set the record straight. With respect to the Soviets, remember that in 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviets were allies, and they both invaded Poland, which started World War II in Europe. In August 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, which included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence, anticipating potential, quote, territorial and political rearrangements of these countries. As I mentioned, the Nazis invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, starting World War II. The Soviets invaded Eastern Poland on 17 September. Following the Winter War with Finland, the Soviets were ceded territories by Finland. This was followed by annexations of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and parts of Romania. On 22 June 1941, 2 years later, almost 2 years later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union, thus ending their alliance. So for 2 years, the Soviet Union was part of the Axis, not a part of the Allies. And additionally, during World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April of 1941. So they also were not involved in the war against Imperial Japan for most of the war. That allowed Stalin to focus on the attack from Germany. The Soviets weren't such a great power in World War II, where they sided with the Nazis and then they told the Imperial Japanese that they would not fight against them. The only country that fought both the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese was the United States. And that's an important role that China can't claim. So hopefully I've brought up some interesting points and made the record straight and made you aware of the threatening language that Xi Jinping has used against Taiwan. Again, thanks for the opportunity. I wish you well.
You did do all of that and more. Colonel, thank you so much for your contributions to the program. I want to emphasize something you touched on in passing at the very beginning, a conspiracy. And I don't think you actually used the term crinks in this conversation we did in our interview with you previously. This conspiracy is a term that was introduced to describe what specifically Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, are up to. I'm quite sure the president didn't mean to exclude the Iranians. They're in the mix as well, of course, that Crink's team. He said in a somewhat puckish social media post on Truth Social in the midst of this military parade business, a welcome to his counterparts in China, Russia, and North Korea. But he also pointed out that they are conspiring against America. And to address in some detail what that conspiracy looks like, would like to go next to one of those who is with us live. I'm very pleased to say, J.R. Nyquist, known to his friends, I'm proud to be one, as Jeff. He is also a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, a brilliant strategic analyst, a blogger. You can follow his work at J.R. Nyquist blog. He is an author as well, among other books, a very important one entitled The Lies We Believe in China, Russia, and the Communist Revolution in America. We're delighted, as always, to have his expertise on specifically what seems to be now underway in terms of not just strategic planning among these conspirators, but what may be ominous early warning indicators of movement into a next kinetic phase of what I call World War Xi. Jeff, welcome to this program. Thank you so much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Frank. I'm just going to go over the China's strategic war preparations and the signs and testimony that they are preparing for a larger war against the West and the United States in particular. The present Chinese buildup on the coast, they have moved thousands of fighting vehicles, including 1,400 additional vehicles this year, to the coast. This year it has been infantry armored fighting vehicles. They have also outfitted 60 ro-ro ships to carry armored fighting vehicles, and these can carry over 1,000 up to 2,000 vehicles in each ro-ro ship. China has been engaging in naval drills ongoing throughout the summer, including naval drills with Russia, and I believe North Korean submarines have been involved in these. China is also engaged in an Air Force buildup in recent days. They have forward positioned 400 additional fighter aircraft, with about half stationed opposite the Yellow Sea in the direction towards Japan and 200 opposite Taiwan. This reinforcements, in addition to aircraft already stationed in the area, they had began this a larger buildup around 2022, around the time that the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, or shortly after that invasion. The next point is the alliance that China has with Russia, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and other what we might call the new communist bloc countries. NATO officials, including the head of NATO, has recently said that Russia and China are both preparing for a long war against the West. China is supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine, as Chinese trains full of ammunition have been arriving to the Belarusian border with Poland, where Russia is also engaged in a military buildup. China is supporting this. China is supporting Russia by allowing, together with North Korea, free access to the river that borders Russia and North Korea. That river leads up to the border that is between Russia and China, where China has prepared military units that they want to move, possibly downriver to Korea or an invasion of Japan. Not sure why Russia wants to move barges up this river, and China wants to move barges up this river, and Russia and North Korea are giving the thumbs up. China has been sending troops to North Korea. I have reports from Chinese sources on this that go back more than a year and a half. In Wednesday's parade in Beijing featured Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, and the dictator of North Korea. Among officials from Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba were there. China has also positioned troops in Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere. This is particularly important because China has been participating with Russia and Iran in an operation tunneling out a mountain near Caracas into which they have installed IRBMs. There are IRBM silos visible from satellite photographs that can be obtained by anyone who wants to pay for the satellite pictures. There are double track rail lines running into this tunnel. We only see about 100 yards of track, maybe 150 yards of track, going into the tunnel, but it disappears under the city of Caracas and reappears in an airfield, which looks to be controlled by the Russians, where the train is obviously able to pick up missiles or whatever they want to put under this mountain. There is an indication, the way this missile silo complex is created, that these IRBMs have some kind of reload capacity. So the 22 tubes that you can see from space, it is every indication they can be reloaded. China has headquarters near this mountain, so do the Russians, and the IRCG have positions there. There are Chinese troops in Venezuela. This is not a secret. China is also all over Africa and Latin America. There have been reports of Chinese troops in Mexico even. And of course, Chinese workers in various countries many of them are PLA reservists. This includes Africa, of course, where there's very important mines and natural resources the Chinese are attempting to strategically control. The South African regime, of course, is part of BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China plus alliance. And of course, there on South Africa, you can interdict, not only is it a tremendous mineral storehouse in South Africa, but you can interdict the tanker traffic from the Middle East from there, because that's the Cape Waterway. China has been moving, and by the way, China has built a submarine base in the South African area in Namibia, so they can use those submarines to interdict the tanker traffic. China has been moving weapons into Mexico secretly and bringing drugs through Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela for years, and even into the United States, especially fentanyl. There's been a major fentanyl bust in Houston. I think it's the biggest drug bust in U.S. history. And of course, Russia and China have this unlimited partnership. They announced just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, during the Beijing or at the start of the Beijing Olympics that year. China has declared itself strangely an Arctic power and has been building up an icebreaker fleet. Now, this is a bit of a mystery until we realize, we look at the Russian press, and the Russian press for years has been discussing the possibility of moving its northern fleet through the Arctic ice into the Pacific to join with the Chinese. This has actually appeared in the Russian press. So all of these things indicate cooperation with Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and other communist countries. Now, the third major item in preparation is China is building the largest drone force in the world. They have been active in Ukraine war with units studying the way this war is fought. And this has influenced China in the last 3.5 years. China has committed more and more to the building of drones, to the creation of the most powerful drone fleet in the world. China has been developing by smuggling drones from chips, very advanced configured chips from the United States, illegally. They're not supposed to get these things to put into these drones. So these drones can be flown without the need of a human pilot. This is very significant in swarm drone attacks. And that's what this AI technology allows. You can have swarms of hundreds or thousands of drones to attack ships, airfields, you name it. As we've seen in Ukraine, drones have successfully attacked surface vessels, tanks, artillery, supply stores, and even aircraft. The Ukrainians have shot down Russian aircraft with drones over the Black Sea. China has been testing, by the way, this is something that only the Chinese we know have, a new supersonic drone which can carry nuclear warheads. Now, China has been caught smuggling military drones into Libya. They were caught smuggling them, transiting them through Italy, disguised as farm equipment. As seen in Russia, the Ukrainians have proved that drones can be smuggled into a hostile country and used to attack strategic air bases, which was very dramatic here not long ago. Considering the flexibility and utility of drone weapons, the Chinese policy of infiltrating the United States economically becomes more dangerous since the Chinese might have thousands of drones already on American soil, hidden on property controlled by Chinese companies. Now, the fourth item, strategic item that I want to touch on is China has been preparing an infiltration invasion or attack on the United States. We first heard about this from the Russian defector Colonel Stanislav Lunev. He was a GRU officer who had worked in China, spoke fluent Mandarin, was involved in some of the negotiations with China to unite their intelligence and to create the operational plans and strategic plans for a future attack on the United States. This was all organized in 1991 and early 92 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The policy, according to Lunev, was that Russia would invade Alaska and parts of Canada. They would own those. And if victory was assured, China would own the lower 48 states, with other countries invited in for looting rights. This strategy, Lunev said, would be based on the German invasion of Norway in 1940, which was an infiltration invasion. The Germans invaded through the British fleet by infiltrating commandos through Sweden and infiltrating ships right past the British fleet as, differently flagged merchantmen carrying German soldiers and heavy armament. This is how the Germans captured Norway in 1940. This is sort of the model for China invading the lower 48 states. Evidence has since appeared since Lunev's testimony to the U.S. Supporting Lunev's claims. First, there was the Sidewinder report in Canada, a joint study that came out in 1997 of the RCMP and CSIS, the Canadian CIA, that discovered that the Chinese triads were aligned with the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese intelligence service to infiltrate the Canadian economic system, to be able to launder money to take control of the Canadian political system so that they could use Canada to attack America in the flank. I was in Toronto last September, and Canadian politicians told me that they believed this had already happened, that China had taken over Canada from within. Other evidence comes from Mexico. We have the work of Scott Gulbranson, who wrote the book The Silent Invasion. He was a Las Vegas reporter who went down there to find out what the communists were doing, and he found evidence that the Chinese were moving weapons and stockpiling weapons in Mexico and smuggling some of these arms caches into the United States. He covers that extensively in his book. Also, again, to facilitate a infiltration invasion. There have been many sources since then, isolated sources from Mexico, reporting on this, and you can find them. They're all over the place. This touches on the mass Chinese explosion of Chinese illegal immigration into the United States. And the conclusion is we have an alarming situation on the border.
On the border and now inside the country. Jeff Nyquist, thank you. This is very bracing information, needless to say, and I appreciate, as always, the broad sweep of your expertise and understanding of it and your ability to relay it so powerfully. We're going to turn to one of our duty experts on the Middle East, but he happens to have an expertise across the planet, really. His name is Dr. David Wormser, one of our top people in our Victory Coalition, which is focused on countering the Sharia supremacist threat, but it is also manifesting itself as another arm of the Chinese conspiracy, notably with respect to Iran. David has served in senior positions across the United States government as a naval intelligence officer, as an advisor to an undersecretary of state and national security advisor and vice president of the United States. He is these days the director of the Mideast program at the Center for Security Policy, and we're delighted to have him with us live as well. And David, we're looking forward to your thoughts on China and Iran and how this part of the Crinks conspiracy is shaping up to be also a very serious problem. Jeff has touched on some aspects of it, particularly in our own hemisphere, but talk to us about the Middle East as well, if you would.
Sure. I mean, those who deal with the Middle East tend to look at the Middle East only through the lens of the Middle East, and they tend not to, in recent times, I mean, this wasn't the case 50 years ago, but in recent times tend to look at it very narrowly because of that, and they miss the larger strategic plays at work inside the Middle East. Now, building on everything Jeff said, because it really, ultimately, it's anchored to what Jeff said. The Chinese have a very geographic-based strategy. They have a series of nations that are trying to extend the Belt and Road into the Middle East. We see it with Iran, Syria, Turkey, and then you have in North Africa the Chinese Belt and Road extensions into Africa with the collapse of Soviet or Russian position in North Africa because of the weakness of Russia and the collapse of Syria, which was the logistical hub for Russia. The Chinese have a much greater role now throughout sub-Saharan Africa that is pushing northward all the way to the littoral. So you have this large extension here, and against it, you obviously have another bloc that's trying to compete with it, the Israelis, the Saudis, the UAE, although the UAE and Saudis are hedging a bit because they're not confident. So if you put that all into context, there is a standard or a more traditional strategic view of the importance of the Middle East. It is a battleground. It's a battleground that has tremendous American interests involved, obviously. And it's a battleground that we have limited assets. And so we've discussed this before in various different programs that Frank's put together, and including different editions of this program, about how really we need to strategically establish ourselves in the region in terms of freedom of navigation, shut down Yemen or the Houthis in Yemen, to anchor ourselves to the power that Israel has displayed so that we don't have to use that much power. And then ride Israeli victories against critical allies of Russia, of China's, like Iran, and so forth. But I want to focus on one last thing that actually is a big inversion of the situation, which is China's strategy. I think Gordon Chang has it right when he says China seeks to win a war by winning before there's a war. And its strategy is anchored to the idea of displaying such overwhelming power that it sends the signal that, we remember from our own movies, resistance is futile. And you might as well give in now. There's no point fighting a war if you know you're going to lose anyway. So just give in. And that creates a momentum, a tremendous momentum that feeds itself. It feeds itself in terms of confidence, production, economics, everything. And so China is essentially using what we used to call correlation of forces, an overwhelming superiority of force against the West to turn the tide of global momentum toward their red star and have the American eagle decline. And that feeds itself. And they hope that they can win these wars without even having to fight them as a consequence, or get what they need to further weaken their adversaries, Taiwan and Japan and so forth, to further weaken them without a fight. But it all is dependent on this perception that China is massive and unbeatable. Now, how do you respond? You have some Steve Bannon would argue that you need to start cutting China off from our technologies and so on and so forth. And I think that's important. I think it's a critical element, but alone it won't do it. What you really need to do is change the correlation of forces. Now, that means, of course, America has to seriously now mobilize for war, which the American people are still very loath to do. I'm talking about World War II type industrial mobilization to stand down China and take their defense buildup and challenge it and bury it, hopefully, at the end. But this takes time. It takes will. The will isn't fully there, and there's no program yet to build America up that way. So that's leading, again, to the same place, this idea that it's not that hopeful. So therefore, China sort of wins. We have to sort of give in and let them rewrite rules of the game, which then feed this and go further. But the Middle East offers something else that I think is an earthquake that changes all that. When Israel struck Hezbollah with the Operation Grim Reaper, and then afterwards struck Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, it was impressive. A lot of people thought, wow, that was good intelligence work. It was quite capable. But I don't think that it was fully understood what just happened in that moment. Because Israel also, the day or two before the Beeper operation, paralyzed Hezbollah's missile structure. There should have been 1,000 to 2,000 missiles shot at Israel in the weeks before the Beeper operation, and they weren't. And they weren't because they never managed to get the missiles out of their preparatory places, and there was no command and control to govern them, and Israel preempted. And then came the Beepers, and then came... So essentially, Israel, one would say, reinvented how war is fought, and they took out Hezbollah without a fight. The nation or the entity that was assumed to have almost 1/3 missiles, anywhere from 250,000 to 500,000 missiles, would do damage to Israeli cities, kill hundreds or thousands of Israelis, suddenly couldn't get off a shot and was catastrophically defeated. You could say, okay, well, the Israelis have been focused on Hezbollah for a decade or two. What else? Well, what Israel did is it literally cut and paste what it did with Hezbollah, and they applied it to Iran. Now, Iran is more serious. Iran is a nation that is 10 times as large as Israel in population, 35 times as large as Israel in terms of geography, and quite far away. And it's sophisticated. It had very advanced Russian equipment, Chinese equipment, and so forth. And the Iranians are fairly capable people. So Israel was facing a very dangerous circumstance. And it struck. And what it did was it took what it did with Hezbollah, it cut and pasted, and it did it with Iran. And we don't fully understand the parameters of what Israel did, but it was an entirely new structure of warfare, entirely new way of approaching warfare. And the truth was, Iran couldn't even get a shot off for the first hours, and it was essentially paralyzed throughout the whole war. And it shot missiles, and the missiles, some hit, and there were 25 Israelis killed. Or 28 Israelis killed. But at the end of the day, Israel took down the entire structure of a nation much larger, much more powerful than itself, and paralyzed it and won, and had them literally prostrate at their mercy. There was nothing Iran could do. They were completely vulnerable to whatever Israel chose to do at that point, including full freedom of skies. Now, is that transferable elsewhere? Yes. Yemen, we just saw it happen in Yemen with the Houthis. The Israelis did the same thing again. Now, this is really important because China must look at this, and it must tell itself, if Israel has a cut and paste new form of warfare that, quite frankly, annuls order of battle, and that's the key point, annuls order of battle, the entire calculation of China in this massive defense buildup is a big question mark is put on top of it. If Israel can teach the United States how to do this form of warfare, which my understanding is the discussions are already underway, if Israel can teach the United States how to do this form of warfare, it introduces into Chinese defense planning and their whole strategic image of being in control of the momentum, being overwhelmingly powerful. It takes that and it introduces variables into that calculation that raise a question mark, both in Beijing and anybody who then feels they should align with Beijing. So I would argue that for the first time, we may see coming out of the Middle East, not just a strategic play in the Middle East, but that in some ways, Israel now has assumed a central role in the Chinese Western competition, the CCP Western competition, in that it has found a way of warfare that should, in the very least, raise very serious questions about China and its overwhelming force if the West both embraces that and incorporates it into its defense planning. And just the fear of that, or the instability of that, or the insecurity that Beijing would have in its strategy would give then time for the United States to mobilize, which is one of the key problems, is if we start mobilizing today, China will see it and they're ahead. And they may preempt. This could give us a window of opportunity.
No, it's brilliant and very, very important live, because it'll be very important to have a give and take with Jeff Nyquist, who's also, of course, still with us, I'm pleased to say. We do have one final presentation by videotape. One of our most faithful contributors to this series of programs, Colonel Grant Newsom, United States Marine Corps, retired. Grant has not only the lifetime of experience as a very, I think, highly decorated and accomplished military officer, but also as a foreign service officer, working the diplomatic side of the portfolio out of Embassy Tokyo for a number of years. He's been a businessman and entrepreneur out in the Western Pacific for years after leaving government service. He is also the author of an incredibly timely and very much relevant book entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. And we're delighted to have him get the last word and do what he does so well, which is to hopefully sort of wrap up this extremely important conversation. And let's go to the videotape with Colonel Newsom now.
What I'm going to do today is I want to just answer a question, and that is really, how worried should we be about this alignment of China, Russia, and North Korea? And you can add in Iran and Venezuela if you want, but it's really those three that I mentioned. Make no mistake, these guys have got some wasta. Their alignment of strategic interests is such that we have some real reasons to be worried. And you look at what they've actually accomplished in the context of the Ukraine war. And this is cooperation and actually some tangible military and political advantages and accomplishments that they've made that really deserves to be taken seriously. You consider it that China has provided all-out support to Russia from the very beginning, and they've given approval to the North Koreans for all the support that they've given. The ammunition, the artillery shells, 10,000 troops, you name it. And that's because China's allowed it to happen. And Russia has gladly, willingly accepted this. And it has allowed Russia to prosecute the war for longer and in a way that otherwise would not be possible. And this military cooperation translates into political cooperation. And I would say that based on this, that Xi Jinping actually sees his long-term objective of dominating the world, defeating the United States as within range. And we may laugh about it and think, oh, it could never happen. But Xi Jinping might see it's possible and like the improvements, the progress that's been made. And keep in mind that they don't have to defeat us necessarily on the battlefield even, but they just have to distract us enough, gradually weaken us. And that's been ongoing for 10 years at least, for several decades, probably, if you consider things like the fentanyl assault on the United States that's killed well over 500,000 Americans since 2012. That's like taking 2 or 3 divisions of troops off the battlefield every year. And that's just the dead. The wounded, the zombies who don't function in our society, are probably 10 times as many. So this is all part of a long-term effort by the Chinese. And you might look at the illegal immigration, the migrant invasion that took place. Well, that wasn't just coincidence. That was another aspect of China's long-term political warfare, and done with cooperation of the Russians in order to weaken us, weaken the United States. It's this entropic warfare that people sometimes refer to. It's this breaking down of a society. And the latest cooperation between the North Koreans, the Russians, and the Chinese is something that just moves things farther in the direction that Xi Jinping in particular wants to go. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you'll hear people say, well, the Russians and the Chinese don't really like each other. There's nothing much to worry about there. And North Korea, well, they're just a weird little country. Well, North Korea's gotten their military, their nuclear weapons, and their missiles into a pretty good state. And the survivability of that regime seems more likely than it's ever been. But get back to that point is that the idea that the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans, and throw in the Iranians and Venezuelans and Cubans aren't really much a way of allies, that they're not anything to worry about. Well, and you hear, well, we have allies. The Americans have allies. So what I want to do is very quickly just go down the list of our allies just in the Pacific, the ones that we're counting on to help us deal with the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans. Well, go look at Japan. We put a lot of stock in them. Well, the Japanese military is about half the size it needs to be to handle all the missions that are necessary. A couple of years ago, the Japanese military missed its recruitment targets by about 50%, 50. It routinely misses them by 25%. It hasn't got the war stocks, the know-how, or the psychological preparation to fight a war. They're just not ready to do it, despite having some niche capabilities and despite having some units, particularly in the Japanese Navy, that are game. So that's some grounds for real concern, and we're counting on the Japanese as our big ally. Now, South Korea, they have a military that is geared to fight a war, and I think it is ready, but it's glued to the Korean peninsula. But even worse, what you're saying in South Korea is you've had the takeover by a leftist regime in June that is pro-North Korea, pro-China, and does not like the United States. In fact, it would like to be rid of the U.S. South Korean alliance, and if it could. And back to Japan, well, they've got domestic chaos going right now as the Liberal Democratic Party's collapsing. So here we have Japan, South Korea, and they've got this, so there's some problems. Now, what about Australia? Well, the Australian Navy has about 11 ships in it, 11 warships. That's not very many. Their military is too small. It's only got 50,000 troops or so. It's losing people. It's only got 5,000 trigger pullers. The Air Force is useful, but it's not a huge contribution that they make to anything. So it's once you sort of pull the curtain away, things don't look quite as good as they are. And in Australia, the Labour Party has always been basically anti-American, anti-military. Well, the Labour Party's running the show down there. So today's Australia is not the one it was 30 years ago. Now, Singapore, that's a small place, but how much use will they be in the event of an actual fight? They're questionable, and one never quite knows. So there's limitations there. The Philippines, that's a bright spot. They're willing to fight, defend themselves, but they're really not able to defend their maritime territory. And a bigger problem, once again, is domestic politics. They have a very pro-American, supportive president, President Marcos. But once he's out of office, and pendulums do have a way of shifting back the other direction. If you get somebody different, say like Duterte, who preceded him, well, China just might like what they see, and I think there would be a weakening in the support for the United States. India, well, they're potentially a very good ally, but they are focused on their northern border, dealing with the Chinese up there. There's limits to what they can do, and in recent weeks, really, there's been some problems rising up with the U.S. going after India on the trade front, but also really criticizing India for buying Russian oil. Yes, India shouldn't be doing that, but the Indians notice, well, at the same time, you're criticizing us, you're not doing anything to attack China. That is not just buying a lot more oil than us, they're providing all sorts of support to the Russians. It's not a lost cause with the Indians. And keep in mind that Prime Minister Modi, when he visited China, he came from Japan, where he had some very good political defense meetings with the Japanese. And keep in mind that President Modi did not attend the so-called victory in World War II parade, which Xi Jinping put on. But so there's some, you can see there's limits to where we are with the Indians as well. You go to the Pacific Islands, particularly the Central Pacific, where we're expecting those island states and our territories to give us free access to operate militarily in the Pacific, particularly if we have to fight in the Western Pacific. Well, those are under immense Chinese pressure, Chinese political influence, warfare, and it just might be that we're not as welcome as we're expecting ourselves to be. So what I'm getting at here is that we maybe are counting too much from our allies as things stand now. And in fact, I would suggest, back to the Pacific Islands, that the head of any sort of Chinese business association or timber or fishing company probably has more real influence these days than Admiral Paparo at Indo-PACOM has. So we've got a military, political, and an economic calculus that we have to weigh with our allies. And it's not quite clear that it's as strong as we think it is. And that's something that really needs to be addressed, particularly when we're talking about having to deal with a unified enemy, or at least unified enough, with the Russians, the Chinese, North Koreans, and others. So what do we do about this? What's the way forward? Well, if your allies aren't very good militarily, make them better. Make them better so they can fight themselves and also operate with us. There's a lot of work to be done. If you can do that, then that manifests a sort of a political, psychological alignment and strength that we've got, and then it's useful against our enemies. And we're going to have to break ultimately into two trading blocks globally. And it's not going to be allowed that our allies are straddling the fence, doing business with China, even with the Russians, but particularly with China, while we're supposed to do the hard work of defending them. We're going to have to get that thing corrected. And also we have to go on the offensive, exploit the vulnerabilities in these three nations that I've mentioned. And it's called political warfare. And we used to do it well. We don't do it at all these days. It seems we've entirely forgotten about it. Nobody seems to be responsible for it at a minimum. And also do things like really nothing that benefits our enemies, nothing that benefits China economically, etc., and expose the obscene wealth of their leadership. That's the one thing that really scares them. So those are just a few ideas. And the bottom line here is we do well to take this China, Russia, North Korea alignments very seriously. And if we don't, then we're going to find that as it develops, we've got some bigger problems. And one thing we do need to do is stop helping our enemies, but also get our allies so that they're actually useful allies. So thanks very much for having me today.
Thank you, Colonel Newsom. I have to say, I think this series of presentations that we've had, both in person and by video, is as good as any program that this series has sponsored. It's absolutely first rate, and it could not be more timely. Because if there is, in fact, a conspiracy against America, as President Trump has asserted, and these sorts of factors are operating, whether it's the political warfare that our enemies are waging against us, or whether it is the military capabilities that are now being put into place, including, as Jeff Nyquist has pointed out, in some very advanced stages, this is making the kind of admonition that Colonel Newsom has just left with us extremely, extremely important. I want to just very quickly ask both Jeff and David to comment on that last sort of net assessment by Colonel Newsom, if you would. Jeff, maybe go first.
Yeah, no, it's very good, and it doesn't go too far. The Chinese are preparing for a war, and the weakness of the West that he points out, especially with Australia and the government there, and of course, New Zealand. These countries, I know a little bit about the situation. The Australia has neglected its military, as has Canada, in ways that make them so dependent on us. And yet this government, as he pointed out, is anti-American. And Australia is quite close to China and is really in the front line of being threatened. If China is going to invade a Western country, so-called Australia is sort of got the front row seat. And of course, Japan is very close here. And Japan, of course, is very concerned about Taiwan because of the links of those two countries, the affability between them. And of course, South Korea is in there. And you've got this place where Russia, China, and North Korea come together in Northeast Asia and can really smash these countries if America does not have the strength to support them, because these countries can't stand on their own.
The India question is because India is, of course, the big actor out in the East beyond China, with its population and its relative level of technological prowess and so forth. And I think that it's a difficult relationship with India, but it's one that we can't write off because it really does stand against China's global strategy. It works closely with Japan. Japanese-Indian relations are fairly close. And it really does represent a weak, slightly cracking, but nonetheless existing pillar of Western strategic posture in the Far East. So I wouldn't rule out India, and I would really work to try to cultivate ties to India. I think we've been derailed because of the Indo-Pakistani war, and we took sort of a neutral position where the Indians were not very happy with that, questioning that too, because Pakistan was very much in sort of a proxy in some ways for China in that war. So I think that there's a lot of tensions between America and Delhi that emerge from really, in my view, some missteps on what happened 2 months ago with the Indo-Pakistani war. India thought it was clear America would side with it, and we took that neutral position. So I would comment on that. And then the second thing is, as far as the technological prowess of our allies, the global war launched by the CCP with their allies, Russia, India, and so forth, has already been waged for 3 years. We have battlegrounds, and in those battlegrounds, armies have tested their weapons. Our enemies have developed counter strategies. We're beginning to see real new things that are part of this warfare enter production. We saw it in the Middle East. And I think that we have to very carefully now examine the fact that most of the militaries of the Western countries are obsolete. They have not put the money into their militaries over the last 2-3 decades to keep up. They're not one generation behind. They may be 2 or 3 generations behind where the United States is, where the Israelis who are on the front line, even to some extent, although it's lower tech, where the Ukrainians are, and certainly also where our enemies are. The Russians and the Chinese have started developing new ways of doing war that we need to incorporate into our defense planning. And we have those militaries who are facing it and are beginning to come up with responses. Europe is not there. New Zealand is not there. Australia is not. The whole ANZUS structure is not there. Well, the US part of it is to some extent, but the Australia and New Zealand are not there. I think Japan needs a major upgrade in its defense. So I agree. We're just not. Our allies, one, we need to try to reel India to our side. And two, I think that our allies are just not up to the game at this point.
We've gone a bit long with our various presentations, but I think very importantly so. So we're almost out of time. Let me just put a final proposition to you both to respond to, if you would. I think, David, to your point just now, that we've been really involved in, whether we acknowledge it or not, a shooting world war. Some call it World War III. I call it World War Xi because, as I think, among others, Jeff has pointed out, much of this has been orchestrated by Xi and is certainly being done to the benefit of China in terms of weakening us, in terms of dissipating our energies, distracting us, and so on. At the risk of leaving people with the impression that our enemies are, as the old saying goes, 10 feet tall, I did just want to note that I think this conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't acknowledge that there are real problems inside each of these CRINC countries. China has huge economic problems, evident political instability. There's also talk of, Xi possibly being toppled, demographic crisis, and so on. Russia, there's now talk that the Russians are very concerned that the cumulative effect of this bloodletting that they've been going through and the economic, consequences as well in the war with Ukraine are possibly going to create conditions under which there will be not only a destabilization of the government, but possibly the fracturing of the country, with quite possibly their Chinese allies picking up some of the pieces, particularly in the Far East. Iran, of course, as David has talked about, is still trying to recover from the so-called 12-day war. A lot of issues internal to it, and hopefully more to come. And North Korea, while it is, got an immense military capability, it is destitute, and the stability of that regime is always a function of essentially, the regime leader. So would each of you address the following question? Is all that good news for us? Or, well, the minimum, could it be exploited by us, particularly if we follow, I think, Colonel Newsom's prescription for political warfare against these regimes? But might it also be the case that, as tyrants often do in such circumstances, this proves to be a further catalyst for what we're quite concerned may well be now in the offing in terms of not just global governance through, diplomatic machinations, but a shooting war. David, let's start with you, and we'll go to Jeff second.
You raise an important point that a lot of these sorts of regimes, which tend to be based on totalitarian ideologies, they either fly or die. And they know that, which means if they feel the forward movement of their aircraft is stalling, they'll go for the Hail Mary pass. So there's always an extreme danger dealing with these regimes. It is true that they're vulnerable. I mean, if you look at China right now, there are deep fissures, both in terms of their economic structure, their government structure, their politics, and so forth. But it also makes imperative how urgent our response is to use these vulnerabilities, whether it's what I described about the Israeli way of war that's being reinvented by them, whether it's the defense buildup. The reason why is, on the 50th anniversary of Munich, Williamson Murray in Commentary magazine wrote an article, and basically his point was it was really the conceding of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia to the Nazis that gave them the technology to get out the kinks of their military. Their military was not functioning very well. It was not an on-par military in 1938. By 1940, it was. And the reason for it was because they had taken over very advanced Skoda works and so forth. Now, China's been doing that by browbeating the West into economic concessions and so forth. It's been essentially taking the Skoda works to itself. But it emphasizes the more important point, which is the longer we wait, the more we're forced to give in, the more the real power that China has to defeat us and overcome its vulnerabilities grows. We have to treat this as an acute, immediate crisis.
David, thank you. Let's go to you, Jeff. Your thoughts, please, quickly.
David, I think, is exactly right. It gets worse if we procrastinate. It seems that your question about economics, yes, these countries are vulnerable to economic sanctions, but the West has not shown the will to close all the loopholes and really do it seriously. We could damage them, maybe disrupt their mobilizations and their preparations for war, but we're not doing it, and it may be past the time when we can.
A chilling thought, a bracing fear, if not dispiriting, bracing conclusion to this incredibly important conversation. When we look at what Donald Trump is trying to do, it seems to me, right in certain respects, and unfortunately still not reflecting the kind of urgency and the kind of call to action that is needed. He is, as we speak, apparently going to change the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. The timing may be interesting if we find ourselves in a war of a different kind than we've been experiencing and we've been ignoring for far too long. I pray that what will be the takeaway for both those of you listening to this program as we speak, as well as those who will in the days to come, that you will take action as you've been called to do here by our colleagues. There are things that can be done both on the global governance front and on the war footing that I personally have been urging since 2013 with a series of colleagues, including some of those involved here today. We are at war, ladies and gentlemen. And the old line that our friend Karen Sigeman has used about, sort of a riff on the idea of if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it still make a sound? She asked this question notably in connection with our wonderful roadshow that she led last fall. If a war is underway and you're not paying attention to it, can you still lose it? And we may be putting that to the test right quick if we do not heed the kinds of warnings that our friends Captain James Fennell, Alex Newman, Kermont Lavani, the wonderful folks who we've got with us still, David Wormser and Jeff Nyquist, of course, as well as Colonel Grant Newsom. These are among the most important voices in our country today, in my estimation. I'm proud to be able to bring them to you and to be associated with them and to second with the greatest of earnestness their calls, not only to be aware of the dangers we face, but to share information about those dangers with your circles of influence and to join us at the Committee on the Present Danger China in trying to defeat our enemies in World War Xi. We'll leave it at that for today. God bless you all. Please subscribe to, for free, our Present Danger China webinar series so you don't miss a further one of these very important programs. Again, thank you for listening. Over and out.